Welcome to this joint in-person meeting and webinar featuring Jeffrey Beall talking about predatory publishers and opportunities for librarians. My name is Philip Gust, and I am the president of the Silicon Valley chapter, and I'd like to welcome you this evening. I want to make a few introductory remarks, and then I will ask our vendor sponsors to come up and say a few words of welcome to you, and then I'll introduce Jeffrey Beall and we will begin. First of all, I want to recognize the event organizers, the Silicon Valley chapter of the Special Libraries Association. So I'd like to thank Gina Frazier, who's the program committee chair, and also the SLA Science and Technology Division, and I'd like to thank Helen Josephine, who's the division chair, and our hospitality chair for the chapter. Thank you very much to both of you for organizing this event. I also would like to recognize several of our sponsors. Our principal sponsor, Springer. Jason was unfortunately unable to come today, but they did send a few slides they'd like to have put up, and Kathy Gust, our treasurer, will be presenting for Springer. Kathy?
Good evening. Springer is a main sponsor for tonight, and they wanted to make everyone aware that Springer does have products that are suitable for almost any kind of library. They do regularly support this chapter and SLA. These slides represent Springer Link, which is their main product. It allows online access to their books and journals. They do cover all these industry sectors, and they do have different ways of you to get access. You can do a direct purchase, you can subscribe, or you can have a deposit account. Here's some of their popular e-products. I know at Stanford, where I work, Springer Images is very popular with our students because it lets them embed images into the things that they turn in as their homework assignments. This one may be of interest particularly to the people in this room from Gilead, but other pharmacy companies. This is a new acquisition. Springer is actively moving into the health sciences and pharma industry, and this is a well-known pharmaceutical product. I'm not particularly familiar with it myself, but it's a new acquisition for Springer. And they suggest that if you're interested in any of their products, that you contact them. They are offering the Mary Ellen Bates white paper. If you would like to get a copy of Leveraging E-Content in Science and Technology, feel free to contact them.
And we'll be making not only the slides that are shown by Jeffrey today in our introductory slides, but also Springer slides available to you after the presentation. Next, our supporting sponsor is Morgan and Claypool. Michael Morgan and Joel Claypool have been very generous in sponsoring this event. Michael, are you here? Please come up and say a few words for us.
Should I stand here? Yes.
Thank you.
Nice to meet you. Hi. I'm Mike Morgan. I'm one of the founders of Morgan and Claypool. And I just thought I'd take a second just to describe what it is we do for those of you who don't know us. We're a digital science publisher. We publish we have two products right now. One of which is Synthesis, which is a digital library of engineering and computer science. The other is Colloquium, which is a digital library of life science in the life sciences. And what we do is somewhat unique. We publish short, what you could think of as books, that survey, overview emerging research areas. The audience is researchers, industry developers, students, primarily at the graduate level. These are meant to be often the first book published in an emerging area and provide a gateway for people to begin to work in that area, then move on to the science, onto the journal literature, So some examples, things like quantum computer science, linked data, which is one of our most successful books. Gazing at Games, a book on eye tracking control, and we're just in the process of developing 2 new libraries. One of which is in physics, in collaboration with IOP, the Physics Society, and we're also developing a new computer science collection of ACM called ACM Books, which both of those will be out next year. So, thank you.
Thanks, Mike.
Oh, and there are brochures on the table.
Phil, could you do that magic thing because we're seeing the split screen right now.
I'm sorry. I apologize for that. Thank you. It keeps switching back. This is a technical problem between PowerPoint and GoToWebinar, which we're trying to sort out. So we should be back on track. And speaking of track, another sponsor, first time for the chapter, is Track Records and Library. And I'd like to invite Evan to come up.
Great segue, Philip. Can't have better than that. Well, for those of you who don't know Track and me, I'm Evan DeMick, Business Development Director at Track Records and Library. And Track is a national placement staffing firm that specializes actually in 2 niches. One is library and library professionals and staff, and then records and information managers. So we just opened, as a matter of fact, this summer, down the road about 1.2 miles is our new office in Foster City that services Northern California and the Pacific Northwest. My colleague Christopher Dang, who's a recruiter in the office, is with me. And I function on the client side, working with companies and nonprofits, foundations, universities, and then Christopher functions on the candidate side. So we encourage you, whether you're interested in staffing needs, have needs on the library side, or you're a job seeker or a candidate on the market, to speak with Christopher. We're available and we'll be here for the duration of the program. So if you didn't speak with us in the input of the program, we're available afterwards. And then I want to thank SLA, Silicon Valley chapter, and then Gilead for the opportunity to sponsor, and Gilead for hosting. So thank you, and thank you to this community.
Thank you, Evan, for being such a generous sponsor as well. So, John, why don't you go ahead and talk?
Okay, thank you, Phil. My name is John Chu, Manager of Literature Resources. It's actually the library, Gilead. And Phil was actually very modest because last year we had a similar event here, and the speaker was actually Phil himself, right? And it was on cloud computing, and that was extremely informative, educational, and we had a good turnout, and we had a good session. So glad to be able to support the second time. Actually, there was one time before that, it was about records management, but I didn't attend that, so I don't know the details. So just very quickly, I'd like to go through what Gilead is about. So we founded in 1987, and we actually had a big 25th year anniversary last year. But we are the leading, in case you didn't know, HIV treatment company in the world. I think we have more than 60% of the market share right now. We're known as a very innovative, science-focused company, kind of differentiating ourselves from more marketing-focused other biopharmas. We're very efficient and rapid in discovery and product development, launching the product quickly. It's a performance-driven culture, and we do a lot of outsourcing. For example, most of our clinical research is outsourced. We aspire to operational excellence and high ethical standards, definitely. And we believe in strong community service. And the last one's probably very important, coming from all the way from our CEO. We hire the best. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Sounds like an exciting set of research programs that you have going. All right, last but not least, before we get going, we're having a door prize drawing. $25 Amazon gift certificate. For those who are here, please put your card in the basket. For those who are webinar participants, please send an email to president@siliconvalley.sla.org with the subject door prize, and we'll be doing a drawing after noon tomorrow, August 22nd. So if you get email in by then, you will be in the entry. We will notify you if you are the winner. With that, our speaker, Jeffrey Beall, Scholarly Initiatives Librarian and Associate Professor, and he's told me he just recently got tenure. Congratulations. University of Colorado, Denver, MLS degree, North Carolina Chapel, MA in English from Oklahoma State in applied linguistics. He's active in the community, editorial board of multiple journals, and he's published extensively in the area of metadata, full text searching, information retrieval. So with that, Jeffrey, over to you.
Great. Thank you very much, Phil, and thank you everybody for coming, and thanks especially to the sponsors. This is the first time I've ever had sponsors while speaking I've done. This talk is the story of the emergence of predatory open access publishers and what I've done to help people from being scammed by them. The title of my talk is Predatory Publishers and Opportunities for Librarians. And I mean opportunities in the sense of when there is an insurmountable problem, you try to see it as an opportunity and not as a problem. First, however, I'd like to tell you a little bit about myself. I've been a librarian for 23 years. I got my library degree, as Phil said, at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, in 1990, and I immediately got a job as a Spanish cataloger at Harvard, where I worked for 10 years. In 2000, missing the West, I grew up in LA County, I took a job at the University of Colorado, Denver, again as a cataloger. Our medical campus, called the Anschutz Medical Campus, is located in Aurora, Colorado. I work on the downtown Denver campus, which is also called the Auraria campus. If you've ever been to the Denver Convention Center, you might have seen the campus, which is located behind it. The campus is unique because it's home to 3 higher education institutions, including the University of Colorado, Denver, for whom I work, a community college, and also Metropolitan State University of Denver. Our one library, operated by the University of Colorado, Denver, and also called the Auraria Library, serves all 3 schools. I worked as a cataloger until a year ago when the library administration invited me to take a new position called Scholarly Initiatives Librarian. The title Scholarly Communications Librarian, which is generally what the job I have is called, was already taken, but the person with that job has been on medical leave for a couple of years, so the title I got was the next best thing. Throughout my career, most of my research looked at 2 things: the weaknesses of full-text searching and the strengths or advantages of metadata-enabled searching. Starting in 2009, I became increasingly interested in scholarly open access publishing, however. I was on tenure track at the time, and I was always looking for new and interesting venues to publish in. The thing that initially sparked my interest in open access journals was the spam emails I kept receiving and still receive from open access publishers. I'm sure you know what I'm talking about. One of the earliest spam email solicitations I remember was for an open access library science journal. I think it was in 2009. I remember being struck by the unidiomatic term call for paper plastered all over the email and their website. There were additional grammatical and typographical errors all over the publisher's website. I also remember being horrified at the fact that the journal would charge me a fee to publish the paper if it got accepted. This was my first exposure to gold open access, and it was not a happy one. I printed out the email and I saved it in a folder. In 2009, I began to write reviews of open access publishers in the journal The Charleston Advisor. This is a library-oriented review journal that publishes reviews of databases that libraries typically purchase. The journal had a policy of allowing reviews on open access resources, so I submitted one about the United Arab Emirates-based publisher called Bentham Open. As time went on, I increasingly began to receive additional spam email solicitations, and many of them were for journals outside my field of library science. And because I had worked so long as a cataloger, it was natural for me to want to keep a list of these publishers, so I began a list. I kept it on my computer at first, and then I published it in late 2010 on an old posterous.com blog I had at the time. This blog platform recently was completely closed down and all of its content was removed from the internet. No one noticed my list then. It had fewer than 20 publishers on it at the time. I just kept monitoring my email for new ones and adding them to the list as time went on. Also in 2010, I wrote a second comparative review in the Charleston Advisor, which examined 9 different open access publishers, and it is in this review that, with help from Hayworth Press owner Bill Cohen, that I coined the term predatory publisher, a term that has since become part of the scholarly publishing jargon. A year later, I gathered up all the information I had. This was in December 2011, and published my second list. One of my librarian colleagues at our health sciences library heard about it and shared it with some others. Soon it was shared with a nursing listserv and was forwarded widely. I watched my blog statistics shoot up, 1,000 views, 2,000, 5,000. It was December 2011 and my list had gone viral. Then in January 2012, I realized I needed a better blog platform, so I switched to WordPress, the platform that currently hosts my blog, which is called Scholarly Open Access and has the subtitle Critical Analysis of Scholarly Open Access Publishing. The blog is located at scholarlyoa.com. Next, I'd like to define some of the terms that I'll be using throughout the rest of my talk. The first thing I want to define is gold open access. I define gold open access as scholarly publishing that is free to the reader with a charge to the author billed upon acceptance of the manuscript for publication. My definition is a little different than the one held by some others, for I make a distinction for platinum open access publishing, which is both free for the author and free for the reader, and this is usually funded benevolently by volunteer work and by organizational subsidy or sponsorship. The Journal of Library Innovation is an example of a platinum open access journal, as is the journal Evidence-Based Library and Information Practice. Some people, especially people in Europe, conflate both gold and platinum open access into simply gold open access, but I think the distinction is important, so I keep it. A predatory publisher or predatory journal is one that exploits the gold open access model for its own profit. It's easy to see how this happens with gold open access. The more papers a publisher accepts, the more money it makes. This conflict of interest is too tempting for many, and they accept papers that don't deserve to be published just to earn the author fee. Ever since I prepared and published my second list in December 2011, I have seen this abuse of gold OA publishing the gold OA publishing model increase exponentially in terms of the increasing number of predatory publishers and predatory standalone journals. Unlike in the past, it's now extremely easy for a publisher to set up shop. Basically, all you need is a website and some unique journal titles, and some don't even check to make sure their journal titles are unique. In other words, the barrier to entry for scholarly publishing has never been lower. Almost no upfront investment is needed. Unlike the traditional print model, becoming a new publisher required a large investment and presented a significant capital risk. Not anymore. These days you can set up a new publisher in a day, and I've seen it done. Now I have over 300 publishers, some with dozens or hundreds of journals included on my main list. Actually, my blog includes 2 lists, one for predatory publishers and one for predatory standalone journals. After the Plus suite of journals became well known and established, a bunch of scammers started to copy the mega journal model, setting up individual journals that I generally call standalone journals. These independent journals don't publish under any named publisher. Like PLOS One, they have a broad coverage, accepting almost anything that can be classified as being in the realm of science. But unlike PLOS One, most of the predatory standalone journals, or BOGUS, have a fake or non-existent peer review and are in operation just for the money. It's a lot cheaper for a publisher to operate a single standalone journal with a broad coverage than it is for a publisher to operate a fleet of journals, each dedicated to a different field of study, each with its own editor, editorial board, and workflow. Thus, this model is growing. I should also mention that many of the predatory publishers also operate scam conferences to accompany their journals, and some are scamferences. I do not track the predatory conferences simply because I do not have the time, and I wish someone would start doing this. So if you're interested in this topic, the area is wide open for research and critical analysis. On this slide, I give some examples of partial screenshots from some questionable publishers. On the upper left, we see one called the BioScan. This is an example of, it's not a publisher, it's a standalone journal. It's just by itself, and so it tries to cover all of the biological sciences. And the thing that I love about this, and one of the reasons why I included it as an example, because they have a typo in the first line under the red box, where they call themselves the BioCan. And every time I read that, it makes me think of a latrine. Woodpecker Journals on the right. Based in Nigeria, most of its titles begin with the phrase Woodpecker Journal of X, such as the Woodpecker Journal of Sociology and Anthropology. This one is basically a scholarly vanity press. One of the things I've learned recently about publishers from Nigeria is that they all try to have salient names like Woodpecker. There's also Greener Journals, which is from Nigeria. There's also one called Wino Journals, and I recently discovered one called Purple Journals. So we have Greener Journals, Purple Journals, Woodpecker Journals, and Wino Journals, and they're all from Nigeria. And somebody told me that that's typical of business naming practices in Nigeria. You want to have a funny name, a name that people will remember. But I don't think it flies very well for scholarly publishing, at least at the international level. The only other thing I wanted to say about this slide is that the Maryland Institute of Research, if you had to guess where that was based, you might think that it was in Maryland, but it's actually in Dhaka, Bangladesh, is where it's located. And they use a mail forwarding service in Annapolis, Maryland. I discovered it over a year ago. I'm surprised to see how many people from the US have submitted papers to them that have been published. This publisher has been very successful at fooling a lot of people into thinking that it's legitimate. Regarding the criteria for determining which publishers or standalone journals are predatory, I published this on my blog, and I'm actually in the second edition of my criteria because after I published the first one in 2012, I received a lot of helpful advice and criticism, and I took this advice and came up with a much better criteria document that I published in December 2012. The intent of my list is to include basically only the worst of the worst. If a publisher is borderline, that is, if it's really difficult to decide whether it's predatory or not, then I do not add it to the list. I realize that there are honest upstart publishers who may be a little sloppy and make mistakes at the beginning, and I endeavor not to include these journals or publisher on my list. Overall, it's hard for a journal to make my list. Generally speaking, the criteria look at intentional deception and lack of transparency on the part of publishers. Publishers that are deceptive or that hide information that academic publishers conventionally provide may find themselves on my list. I've reviewed books for Library Journal for over 10 years. I review science books, especially books about astronomy, earthquakes, volcanoes, and severe weather. Most of my reviews have been positive, but a few have been negative. I see my work with predatory publishers as a reviewing function. I engage in critical thinking about the publishers and share my thinking, my reviews of them, with the world. I encourage all librarians to share their critical thinking with the world. Here are some of the specific criteria I use when I examine and analyze predatory publishers. 1, the journal does not identify a formal editorial board. 2, the publisher has no policies or practices for digital preservation. 3, the publisher begins operation with a large fleet of journals, often using a template to quickly create each journal's homepage. or the publisher provides insufficient information or hides information about author fees, offering to publish an author's paper, and later sending a previously undisclosed invoice. The name of the journal does not accurately reflect its geographic origin. There are many journals that have, quote, European Journal of X in their title that are based outside of Europe. I think there's more British journals based in Pakistan than there are in the UK. Next, the journal falsely claims to have an impact factor or uses some made-up measure like view factor, feigning international standing. Those are just examples of some of the criteria. And I wanted to share with you an example of a part of a spam email I received. You might have gotten the same email. This is from the International Journal of Science and Advanced Technology. It's based in India, although I don't think that they actually reveal that. The most prominent thing about this is the call for papers in the middle there. Submissions due July 27th, notification of acceptance July 29th. So that's their peer review, it takes 2 days. And then it's published on July 31st. So it's obvious that they're not doing an honest and proper peer review here. The reason I have the ISSN here, it's up there in the right-hand corner, and it's also prominently displayed in their spam because in many parts of the world, people believe that if you have an ISSN, the journal's automatically legitimate. And we know that's not true because basically anybody who applies for an ISSN will be given one. But they see it as, many in Asia especially, see it as a mark of legitimacy. The indexing, which is, it's in the green box in the middle there, this is because this shows that they're an author-oriented enterprise rather than a reader-oriented one. They're trying to sell this journal to the authors. They want the author fee. So if you're an author, you want your work to be published in places, in venues that are indexed in the top indexing services. So that's why they mentioned that there. And also the international aspect. There are more international journals now than there ever have been, especially among the predatory journals. And the reason for that is because in India, especially, in many other countries, you get more credit as an academic for publishing in an international journal than you do for publishing in a national or regional journal. So to fill that market need, there are dozens and dozens and hundreds of international journals of X and X, and they're selling their international aspect to the authors because the authors can then get more credit for publishing in an international journal. Now I'd like to talk about scholarly open access publishing itself. I've benefited from open access publishing both as a reader and an author. It's great to have free access to high quality science and availability. That also benefits many libraries. My blog is open access. I practice green open access and upload as many works as I can to EUROJOURNALS, which is this ePrints and Library and Information Science, which is the disciplinary repository for library science. I've also benefited from open access by not having to pay for books and articles that I would otherwise have to pay for. Also, there's growing evidence that there's a citation advantage for OA publications when compared to publications published behind a paywall. I'm sure we all recognize and value the benefits of open access. Still, having said that, I find that the traditional model was the best of all the models that have existed, especially in the context of journals published by scholarly societies. I fear that by moving to open access, we may be giving up some of the great benefits of the earlier system, including the validation function that traditional journals provided. Because they had space limitations, traditional journals could only publish the best articles that they received. With many open access journals, the space limitations are no longer an issue, so they accept a greater number of articles, bringing down the overall quality of the journals. We are seeing many significant drawbacks to the gold OA model, so we need to reevaluate it and see how we can either eliminate the drawbacks or find a better model. Part of the problem with gold open access is that in addition to being an economic publishing model, it's also a social movement, and its adherents are sometimes vocal, intransigent, divided, and unwilling to question the gold OA model. I shouldn't include words that I can't pronounce when I'm writing a script. On the other hand, it's obvious that scholarly communication is going through a period of transition and that experimentation with new models, practices, and standards should be encouraged. One area where we are seeing lots of experimentation is in peer review itself. Some are seeking ways to recycle existing reviews when a paper is first rejected and then submitted. Is open access really the best model? Are there unintended consequences? Open access publisher HINDAWI's profit margin is now higher than Reed Elsevier's. Yet HINDAWI is more like a repository than a publisher, just like PLOS ONE. Both focus more on authors than on readers because that's where the money is. They call themselves publishers of journals, but they share more in common with repositories than true journals. Do we really want a publishing model that serves to please the authors more than the readers? Next, I'd like to explain in greater detail some of the main reasons why predators are problematic. Many gold open access publishers are basically scholarly vanity presses, a model that sometimes is called pay to say. The model works worst in middle-income countries. If you're in a developed country, your funding agency can afford to pay the author fees. If you're in a poor country, you probably will find an OA publisher that will waive the fees. But if you're in a middle-income country such as China, India, Mexico, you may be out of luck. The fees are too high for you to pay personally, and there are insufficient funds to go around to help you with paying the fees. Gold OA is threatening research in middle-income countries more than anywhere else, I think. A minute ago I mentioned scholarly societies and the journals they've been publishing for many years. I think that scholarly societies journals publish among the best scholarship that our nation produces. In librarianship we have journals like college and research libraries that are very high quality journals that benefit the profession greatly. However, scholarly societies in the arts and humanities stand to suffer if the gold open access model is forced on them, for it will decrease their income. Library subscriptions have helped subsidize learned societies programs, and if these subscriptions disappear and are replaced by author fees, society's income will experience a pronounced decrease. Moving on to author misconduct, I think that predatory publishers increase the amount of research misconduct that ends up being published, though I do not have any data to cite to support this. Many predatory publishers do not check for plagiarism before they publish papers. Many do not even put their papers through an honest peer review. The result is that predatory publishers' articles are a breeding ground for research misconduct. They are filled with plagiarism, self-plagiarism, image and data manipulation, salami slicing, which is breaking a research project into least publishable units and publishing each as a separate article, ghost authorship, which is when someone helps contribute to a paper but is not properly credited for it, and honorary authorship, which is when someone is listed as a co-author but didn't contribute to the paper. Do these instances of author misconduct occur with traditional publishers? Yes, of course they do. But with traditional publishers, peer review essentially continues forever, as we've seen by following the fascinating blog Retraction Watch. Fellow scientists find and report errors and misconduct in published works and report them to the publisher. Then an investigation is conducted and the misconduct is dealt with, often by retracting the article. In the case of predatory publishers, it's rare that they even investigate instances of misconduct. Believe me, I've tried. I sometimes test potential predatory publishers by documenting plagiarism in one or more of their articles and reporting it to them. Sometimes there's no reply and the plagiarism remains. Often the publishers will give me the runaround, resulting in no real attempt to address the plagiarism. I also see that the publishers blame the issue on the authors and fail to address it themselves. In a sense, I understand this approach because authors are supposed to warrant that their work is original upon submission, but publishers need to have standard policies for dealing with misconduct that is discovered and reported, and most of the predatory publishers don't. I always check for plagiarism when examining new publishers and journals. I use the manual method because I think it works best in this situation. What I do is this. I read an article, and when the language turns from unidiomatic to idiomatic, I select a phrase and search it as a phrase in Google. More often than not, I get a hit and discover where the text originally appeared. Predatory journals are filled with plagiarism, especially journals published by upstart and smaller publishers. I have a box in my office where I collect printouts documenting cases of plagiarism, duplicate publications, self-plagiarism, and the like. Predatory publishers facilitate the publication of research misconduct, and I think that the amount of published misconduct is increasing because of the big rise in the number of predatory publishers themselves. And speaking of self-plagiarism, I did want to say that some of the text here that I'm presenting today presented earlier at other talks. So I have just cleared myself of self-plagiarism because I cited myself. Here's another way that predatory publishers are threatening both scholarly publishing and science itself. We know that research is cumulative. New research builds on previous research as recorded in the academic record. One of the roles of peer review is to ensure that only true science gets included in scientific journals. There are two terms here that librarians need to know about. And these terms are demarcation and boundary work. Demarcation deals with differentiating true science from non-science and pseudoscience. Because many predatory publishers do a fake or non-existent peer review, much pseudoscience is being published as if it were real science. This non-science later gets cited in other scientific articles, and the result is a breakdown of the scientific process. Articles in quality journals may be polluted with citations from counterfeit journals, journals that never conducted an honest peer review. Boundary work is action taken by scientists to enforce demarcation, that is, to enforce the distinction between science and non-science, and to actively work to protect science from pseudoscience. Astronomers do this when they denounce astrology, for example. Speaking of astronomy, there's a journal on my list called the Journal of Cosmology. It specializes in publishing cosmology papers that don't pass peer review in mainstream cosmology journals. Its website is amateurish. Its articles often contain cosmological views that depart from mainstream cosmological thinking. The Wikipedia article about the journal gives a lot more information about it and the criticisms of it. This is one type of a widely distributed journal that the open access movement has enabled. Setting aside issues surrounding free speech, I know that most of us believe that giving alternative ideas a hearing is generally a good thing. In science, though, it's different because the alternative views only serve to defeat the purpose of peer review. That is to say, they don't respect academic integrity. Another thing worth mentioning about predatory publishers is that they're very good at appearing legitimate. They have mastered the art of looking like a legitimate publisher, and many are fooled by this. Remember, they work for the authors, not for the readers, so when they've gotten the wire transfer from the author or the PayPal payment or the credit card transaction, the deal is done for them. A lot of really smart people have been fooled by predatory journals, and they often later feel great embarrassment about it and become taciturn. This leads to one of the great ironies about predatory journals. Occasionally, they contain some very good research. This happens when they fool a very good researcher or a team of researchers into submitting a paper. Another significant problem with predatory journals is that they don't pay sufficient attention to digital preservation. The publishers, their journals, or their articles may disappear at any time. In fact, most of them don't have any idea of what digital preservation is. They live in the moment, seeking to profit from author fees and not worrying about backing up their content. Not that it's worth backing up. They can also change their model to toll access. This is apparently what happened to most of the journals published by the predatory publisher called EUROJOURNALS, which of course, because predatory publishers often lie, was not based in Europe, but in Mauritius. For some reason, they took all their content offline and told everyone that it would be available through EBSCO's eConlit database, but I'm unable to confirm that the content is really there, but I can confirm that it is gone from the open internet. So all the article processing charges that people paid to have their content published here is lost, as is the content itself. I think this scenario will repeat itself with variations throughout the coming years. Many of the predatory publishers are one-man operations, and when the man is gone or gets bored with it, the journals disappear forever. I want to quickly read a part of an email I received. Quote, I am a junior doctor in the UK, and I received an email from the OMICS publishing group saying that they could offer a rapid peer review process for publishing of academic articles. I went to their website and it seemed fairly ordinary. I read the instructions for authors and sent off my manuscript in the required format. A couple of months later, I received an email from OMICS saying that my article had been accepted for publication and could I check the proof and pay the author fee. To my horror, I opened the file to find an invoice for $2,700. This fee was not mentioned anywhere obvious at the time I submitted my manuscript, and I have never come across anything like this before. I sent an email saying that I could not pay and wanted to withdraw the article. They replied saying, as I have now been assigned a DOI, it is not possible to withdraw, and I can pay the fee in installments. Do I legally have to pay this enormous fee, and could I be in any sort of legal trouble if I do not pay, end quote. I've gotten this email, the essence of this email, many, many times from many different people. Among all the publishers on my list, OMICS Publishing Group's practices are the worst I've observed. It truly deserves the appellation predatory, I think, and I intend to do as much work as possible to help scholars avoid being caught in their traps. They're very clever in what they do. Their spam emails do not mention the author fees, though they are mentioned on their website. Many of their journals have names similar to established major journals in various fields. They send personalized spam email to researchers praising an earlier one of their works and inviting another. This strategy works especially well on junior faculty and graduate students and postdocs who are unfamiliar with the scholarly publishing process. OMICS gets prominent scholars to serve on its editorial boards and then uses their pictures and their names on emails and on websites to attract article submissions and conference registrations. OMICS is a product of the open access movement. The movement has gone astray and is being poisoned by unscrupulous characters. It may be too late to fix it. The validation function that total access journals once provided is being lost, for it's getting harder to separate out bona fide research from fraudulent research. Part of the story is that sometimes the predatory publishers get angry when they appear on my list. I was once called a cyber criminal by a woman in India. She was angry with me because I pointed out that one of the articles in one of her journals was filled with self-plagiarism. She had never heard the term and told me that authors always have the right to reuse their own work even without attribution. I forwarded a copy of a cross-check document explaining what self-plagiarism is and didn't hear from her again. In December of last year, I was a victim of a criminal impersonation campaign carried out by one of the publishers on my list. He used the email spoofing technique, sending out emails to all the publishers on my list, with the emails appearing as if they were from me, including looking as if they were from my personal email account. The emails offered to remove the publisher from the list for a $5,000 fee. In addition to sending the emails, they also posted copies of them all over the internet, including on bogus blogs like the one I've got a screen grab of here, and other social media sites. Many of them are still there. From this, I learned that criminals respond in criminal ways. I've been affected by some legal maneuvering as well. In February of this year, I got an email and a 200-page fax sent at night threatening to sue me if I did not remove the 4 publishing brands of the Canadian Centre of Science and Education from my list and pay $10,000 to the publisher. I learned the difference between a threatening letter and a lawsuit, and fortunately, in this case, the lawsuit has not happened. Also, earlier this year, I requested an investigation about some possible plagiarism that might have been carried out by a professor at a university in Maryland. The professor was the chair of the ethics board at a city's main school district, Baltimore City Schools, and was a professor of accounting at this university. The story made the front page of the Baltimore Sun. A couple of weeks later, I was called into the university counsel's office and told that were this to turn into a lawsuit, that the university would not represent me because reporting plagiarism is outside the scope of my job duties. And I've since been on a first-name basis with the university council. This is an example of whistleblowing. It's popular in some European countries right now, especially reporting plagiarism, and I think it may become more popular here. I'm working on defining a concept I call scholarly publishing literacy. The working definition I have at this time, which is also from a paper I have under review, is this. Scholarly publishing literacy is the knowledge of the essential components of scholarly communication, including the ability to effectively judge the quality of scholarly communication outlets and avoid questionable ones, a working knowledge of the various models of traditional and open access publishing and how they are funded, and a working knowledge of copyright and other licenses for scholarly works, and an awareness of publishing ethics, including common forms of author misconduct and how to avoid them. I suggest that librarians develop skills in scholarly publishing literacy. I think this is one of the ways we can show our value to our users as our role as the custodians of physical library collections evolves. Earlier I talked about reviewing books and mentioned that I see my work listing predatory publishers and journals in a similar light. There's another aspect of this that I want to end with. Libraries, in particular public libraries, have traditionally offered a service called Reader's Advisory. This library function has involved libraries recommending books to readers. Reader's Advisory usually works with belles lettres, for example, when a library patron asks the librarian to recommend a new Western novel. I think librarians ought to adopt the principle of Reader's Advisory to their libraries. However, we need to also adapt the service. We need to recommend good journals to our patrons, and we need to recommend against predatory journals and publishers for our patrons. Librarians will be increasingly asked to make journal recommendations for their patrons, so please prepare for this. Also, libraries need to identify the journals they consider predatory or otherwise malevolent and remove them from all your discovery tools. Otherwise, by including corrupt journals in your library catalog, you're tacitly granting the library's seal of approval to those journals. Help your patrons by removing predatory journals from your library. Just because something is open access doesn't mean it's worth cataloging or otherwise providing metadata for. As Ken Anderson says, more information is not necessarily better information. So what can we do about predatory publishers? The problems with predatory publishers are chiefly ethical rather than legal. Freedom of the press includes the freedom to be a predatory publisher. There's little that anyone can do to defeat them. I'm doing my best to warn scholars about the perils of submitting their work to predatory journals. I think that educating scholars about predatory publishers' scams is the best way to make them go away. Open access can be a wonderful publication mode. I know personally that it delivers a higher readership and more citations. However, the abuse of it is contributing to spoiling the quality of scholarly communication, which is increasingly being threatened by scammers. Those who support open access should rise up and oppose the fraudulent work of the predatory publishers and journals. That's what I've been working on since 2009, and I invite you to join me in the effort. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeffrey. And I'd like to open.
Mike.
I'd like to open questions to the audience now.
Jeffrey, you know, sorry. So I think you're doing good work, and you've been doing good work for a while, so I appreciate that. What I'm wondering is how can the definition of open access be made more clear so that people understand that it's not predatory publishing? Is there a tweak to the definition that needs to be made? And do you have any sense, do you have any data on how big of a problem this really is? Like, has anyone systematically gone through and looked at, okay, here's all of the predatory, articles that have come out. Here are the ones that might actually have passed peer review in a real journal. And the other thing, sorry to make this kind of complicated, multi-part question, was, do you have any plans on moving from just looking at predatory practices of open access journals to looking at predatory practices by traditional for-profit journals as well?
That is a lot of stuff. I don't think that we can change the definition that's already been set. And I use the metaphor of poison. predatory publishers are poisoning open access, because that's really what they're doing. The open access model has a lot of great benefits, as I mentioned, and there's a few people that are ruining it, but it only takes a little bit of poison to make a whole well become useless, and that's what I see happening. Regarding examining the predatory practices of traditional journals, I don't think the world needs me to do that, because there's plenty of people that are already doing it, and they're doing a very good job, and so I don't see my voices really being needed in that area. And I can barely keep up with what I'm doing now. The explosion of predatory journals is just amazing. I thought it would slow down this summer, and it hasn't. It takes me a lot of time to analyze the publishers before I add them to my list, and I've just been overwhelmed with them. And was there a particular other thing that I forgot to answer among your questions?
Yeah, so the middle part was, has anyone actually
Speak
gone,
into the mic, please.
has anyone actually gone through and
Thank
looked
you.
at all publications in these predatory journals, and the journals are in your list? What fraction of them would have been published, would have probably passed peer review at a real journal?
No, not that I know of. I think my guess is that the number would be very low from what I see. I see the worst of the worst, and I see a lot of journals that when I read the articles in them, I say, this is like a high school paper, like a freshman or sophomore in high school. And people are just using them as vanity presses just to get the academic credit.
Yeah, that's the kind of the key distinction that I don't see, because a lot of the websites look ludicrous, look ridiculous. Like how could anyone possibly be fooled by this, and therefore how big of a threat could it really be? But at the same time, on the other side of the coin as well, here are these predatory journals who are fooling people, and I'm trying to see kind of where, because those two things are a little bit at odds with one another, where are the predatory people going to get better? Are authors going to get wiser? Which way is this all going to go?
I don't know. I can't predict the future. I'm trying to do everything I can to warn people about them and help them stay away from it. So I hope that eventually the predatory publishers go away. Good question.
Thanks, Jeffrey. The real victims here, right, are the tenure committees and the administrations that are hiring or promoting or giving tenure to academics based on flawed vita, publication lists. So, how much awareness do you have a sense of how much awareness there is in that community for this?
Yeah, good question. I regularly receive emails from tenure committees, like the chair of the committee, asking me about a particular journal, or asking if there's any, what other tenure committees have done, if I know anything about that, and how to deal with it. I got tenure in 2012, and I was immediately put on the campus level tenure committee, so I had the opportunity to look at people's vitas and stuff. And I only saw 2 articles cited from predatory journals among all the 45 candidates that were reviewed. So I was happy to see that number was low. And we still gave them tenure or reappointment, whatever it was, in the 2 cases. But yes, I do get questions on that. Smart tenure committees will carefully, now you have to go through the vitas and look at each journal title, because the journal titles look impressive themselves, and that's one of the tricks they use. If you don't know the field and you're looking at somebody's CV, it can look pretty impressive, the International Journal of Science or whatever. And so tenure committees have to use more scrutiny now than they did in the past.
I have a question, Jeffrey. Thank you for your fascinating presentation. I did see in your scholarly publishing literacy copyright. So I'm responsible for copyright, Gilead. So this is a question. If these predatory publishers and journals are essentially producing fraudulent material, do you think they are copyright protected?
Oftentimes they publish plagiarism, and the plagiarism is taken from copyrighted works. So in that case, it's plagiarism, and it's also a copyright violation. And I think that it's becoming an increasingly bigger problem for the predatory publishers because people will send takedown notices to some of them. And also, I get emails from authors who have found their plagiarized works in a predatory journal, and they're asking me what can they do about it. They're like searching their own name or searching some of the texts they had written, and they find their own work published, copied completely in a predatory journal. I did a blog post about that recently. So, so yeah, the predatory publishers want the money. They don't really care so much about copyright.
Thank you.
Jeffrey, I've got a couple of web questions.
Sure.
The first one is, how are you protecting yourself legally?
Yeah, that's a good question. Like I said, I'm on a first-name basis with the University Council. I get lots of threats. Regularly I get threats, but so far none has turned into an actual lawsuit. My guess is that the university will defend me a little bit and then probably try to find a way to back out if it ever comes to that. But on the other hand, what I've learned is that when somebody does sue me and it gets publicized, it draws extra scrutiny to the predatory publisher. And that scrutiny is very frightening to them because it threatens their income. So I think that's what saved me from the first lawsuit, threatened lawsuit that happened in February. And I don't know if you know this, but OMICS, earlier this spring actually, threatened to sue me for $1 billion. And I still have the threatening letter on my desk. And it was reported in the Chronicle of Higher Education. And that drew lots of extra scrutiny to them, which I think actually hurt them. So the best thing for predatory publishers to do is not to threaten to sue me.
So we've got another question. If some of these Vanity Press articles show up in the Web of Science, what happens?
There's some overlap between publishers and journals on my lists and stuff that's monitored or indexed by Journal Citation Reports and Web of Science. We use different criteria. Another problem is Scopus also is increasingly including more predatory journals among the journals it indexes, and so is EBSCO, because they compete with each other. So I'm not exactly sure where that's going to go, but I know that there's a blog post recently from a librarian at Massey University in New Zealand bringing Scopus to task for indexing what was just a really super predatory journal included on my list. And I think that as awareness of that increases, that there'll be pressure on the indexing agencies to clean up their act. Yeah, yes.
I was just wondering if the same is true of DOAJ. Are they creeping in?
Yeah, there's also some overlap between me and DOAJ, but earlier this summer they announced, that's the Directory of Open Access Journals, they announced that they'll be tightening up their criteria for inclusion, and tightening them up quite a bit actually, so I'm looking forward to that, and I think that their criteria will come closer to mine than they are now, so hopefully there'll be a lot less overlap.
I had a personal anecdote regarding OMICS, and this was actually because we are a pharmaceutical company, we are subject to very strict regulation regarding our products and what is said about our products, and if there are adverse events about our products that are published, we are supposed to know, and they're supposed to, make proper follow-ups. And there was an article about one of our products in one of the OMICS journals. I didn't realize. I mean, now I'm empowered to go on your list and and look things up, but we were taken to task for not finding this article in our regular searches, which do not include the Scopus database, which might include this journal. Mm-hmm. But it was really interesting, and we had a bit between a rock and a hard place, because that article in itself might have been a legitimate article. I don't know. I mean, I would have to contact the author to figure it out, and I would still have to find it probably. But look at the source. So that's where I see things not being as easy. As just saying, we're going to ignore them, yes, but.
Yeah, exactly, good point. Good story.
Yes.
So I've got another web question over here.
Okay.
Any thoughts on how to strike a balance between the prohibitive costs of many scholarly journals and open access? Some would argue that the pricing of many established journals is predatory.
Right, that's kind of the question that Bill asked. I like Platinum Open Access, which is free to authors and free to readers, and it takes away the conflict of interest of the more papers that they accept, the more money they make. I wish that we would explore more Platinum Open Access. There are dozens and dozens, if not hundreds, of Platinum Open Access journals right now. I would like to see that expanded. They need to be subsidized. I mean, the money has to come from somewhere. But that's an area where I'd like to see more focus on, and I think it would solve a lot of problems. There's a question in the back.
Yeah, you mentioned that you received lots of spam messages making these offers from the predatory open access journals. How do you recognize them right off the bat, that it's not just yet another scholarly journal making an offer or a request for papers?
I've gotten really good at identifying them. Recently, a lot of them have started signing emails with fake female names. I know I did a blog post about that. Also, sometimes they don't sign with any name, they just sign an editor with no name. You have no idea who it's coming from. The really bad ones are really easy. It's the borderline ones that are hard to tell. And so I'm understanding basically your question is saying, how do I, from a spam email, how do I determine whether it's legitimate or not? I go to the website, of course, and then do a full analysis of the site. And increasingly, I'm benefiting from the work of a network of people who forward me spam emails. I think I'm the only person who likes to be forwarded spam. And people also offer their analyses of the publisher and the spam itself, and they share that with me. And they also share their experiences with me if they've published with a publisher. A lot of times they'll go through the whole publication process, not realize it's bogus until late in the process, and then they do a Google search for the journal or the publisher, and then they find my list through the Google search, and then they email me for advice. So in that way, I'm privy to a lot of really personal information about people's experiences with the journals that I can use in my analysis of the publishers and the journals.
You mentioned your list was kind of the worst of the worst. What I'd like to know is how many journals have some predatory aspects but aren't bad enough to be on the worst of the worst. If you would like compare the size of the sort of gray bad ones versus the worst of the worst ones.
I don't know if I can give you a number, but there's a lot. I mentioned HINDAWI. It's a Cairo, Egypt-based publisher. It's not on my list. They have 4 brands of journals. They publish over 500 individual journal titles. It's a very big publisher, and they're making a lot of money. But they're not on my list. There's other ones like that. We were talking earlier about 2 publishers in New Zealand. One's called Libertas Academica, and the other one is called Dove Press, and they're both biosciences and medical sciences publishers. One's owned by the father, and one's owned by the son. They have dozens of journals each. They're not on my list. There's many other cases like that. People sometimes criticize me and say that I put every open access publisher on my list. It's not even close to being true. I really have a minority of them. The bulk of them are not on my list. So I don't want to, this is something I've learned, I don't want to, if it's a legitimate journal, I don't want to ruin it by putting it on my list. I want to give it a fair chance to get going. But if I see deceit or a lack of transparency, then it's more likely that I'm going to put it on my list, because a professional scholarly publisher shouldn't be deceitful in any way. So most of the predators hide where they're from, because they know if people see Pakistan, they're going to be less likely to submit. So they'll either not say where they're from, or they'll lie about it. Yes?
So Megan on the web says, use of Creative Commons licenses also seems to be a way for these publishers to try and appear legit. Any thoughts?
Yeah, there's nothing wrong with them using Creative Commons licenses. So I don't necessarily see a malevolent intention with that. It's hard to say if they're doing it to appear legitimate or if they're doing it because they want to try hard. Very few of them actually use CC licenses. A lot of times they'll use the CC, they'll put the logo there, and right next to the logo they'll say, all rights reserved, copyright, which is contradictory. So a lot of times they are using logos just to impress or to make themselves look legitimate, but sometimes they might do it for a good reason. So that's really not one of my criteria unless it's deceitful or contradictory.
This is John Chu again, Gilead. I was wondering whether you had any comment on what I call expansionary publishing. I'm talking about nature, I'm talking about science. It used to be just nature, it used to be just science. Now it's nature, this nature, that, nature medicine, nature biology. Science is, we have one called Science Translational Medicine. The publisher has been trying to get us subscribed to it for years, and we kind of push them back. So I believe the nature of these publishers, especially scholarly publishing, the reputable ones, they have to not only maintain but expand their revenue. And one way of doing that is what I call expansionary publishing, which is, to me, is ridiculous. So I wonder what your thoughts on that.
Yeah, if they're publicly held companies, then they're responsible to their shareholders, and the shareholders always want increased profits. And so the business model then is to expand, so they do that, and that's the way businesses operate. On the other hand, there's a lot more research being published than there ever has been. There's more scholars that are publishing, and the number of scientific fields is expanding. So the publication rate is increasing a lot. So I think they're trying to accommodate that. Yes. Sorry if I cut somebody off.
You know, this is partially comment, partially question. But it seems to me there are two factors here that are in play. One of which is, what's the selection process, right? I mean, what's the process for the refereeing, and the extent to which that's transparent, and the extent to which people talk about that. Right? I mean, it would be one way to categorize journals. You know, would be, you know, and then the second thing, even though this sounds trivial, is price. You know, if their price were $100 to publish, it's unlikely that you would think of them as a predatory journal, right? When it's $10,000 or $5,000 or $4,000, then you start to get suspicious. I'm just trying to think about it as you develop your list.
No, actually, I have plenty of journals that will charge $100 that are on my list.
Is that right? No kidding, it's that?
Yeah. Mostly the ones from India. Some even charge less than that. They're starting to compete with each other on the lower end.
No?
Yeah. And about peer review, that's why I think that transparency is so important. They say they do a peer review, but I can't see what they're doing, so I can't analyze it. But from the outcome, it looks like they're not doing a peer review. So it's the transparency thing that's so important, I think. I think I cut somebody off in the front. I'm sorry.
That's okay. I have like 4 questions.
Thanks. I want to go back to the slide you had a little bit. I don't remember what you called it, but it was like scholarly publishing education, about teaching people how to evaluate scholarly publishing literacy. So back when I was in library school, we just called that information literacy, about teaching people how to evaluate, you know, the high-tech world of CD-ROM journals. But I mean, you know, effectively, have we just completely given up doing any of this? Because if you taught somebody how to evaluate something that they were reading and using for their research or using for their, you know, educational purposes, I would effectively think that they would know that then use is not something you would want to publish in and would be less likely to be a victim of that particular kind of scam. So and I don't work in a library, so I don't know, do we just not do this anymore, or?
No, there's a lot of talk about information literacy these days. I think this will be a component of it. And I'm working on this for a paper, which is why I included it in here. And I can tell you that I'm on like the third set of revisions for the paper, and it's not going along very well. So I need to do a lot more work on this, and I'm hoping to get a lot of feedback from others on it. But the point I'm really trying to get across is that people need to learn how to deal with these scams, because the scams are going to be a part of scholarly communication. They already are a part, so people need to learn about them. Yeah. Yes?
I'm Karen Hawkins from IEEE, and I wanted to come back to your point about watching for editorial boards and the review process, and not to make your life more difficult, but you know, when we talk to our members and our volunteers, some of the craftier scammers will actually grab names of credible people and claim that they're on the editorial board. I've heard someone more than once say, I saw my name on this thing, and I never heard of this journal. So that does happen too. And I'm not sure how you get to that next level and drill into whether something like that is legitimate, but you know, some people are fairly crafty in how they present these things.
Yeah, that happens all the time. Predatory publishers add people's names to their editorial boards without their knowledge or permission. And usually when they find out, they email me and ask what they can do, and they send an email to the publisher, and the publisher ignores them. I tell them to get the university council involved and to send a mean letter to the publisher from the university council, and that works. And also, since you're from IEEE, I should tell you that there are dozens of predatory publishers that use your article template and copy it and distribute it and to their, you know. Yes, sir.
Okay, especially with this slide up on the screen and the sheer number of these predatory journals out there, you know, how much different if they're essentially watering down the journal system and making it worthless, if there's no peer review, there's no boards, anybody can publish just by paying a fee. How is that different from somebody writing up a paper and just sticking it on a blog somewhere and wrapping a journal name at the top? You know, article number 1 of, you know, the American Journal of Wombats or something like that.
Yeah, I guess in some ways that might not be different, and you could do that. You could make your own bogus journal and publish all your own articles in it.
Like Oprah.
Yeah.
Single author.
Yeah. Anything goes. Okay, I'm being told we're running out of time.
Is there any last burning question? Jeannie?
I'm typing away to see if anybody has anything.
So while they're doing that, the major thing I took away from what you said and the discussion we've had afterwards is that there really needs to be a study of this problem, of how big it is, how many legitimate articles or legitimate authors actually do get fooled, you know, which of the ones are, is it significantly diluting the scholarly record in a meaningful way? You know, are these things getting taken up into things like Scopus and Web of Science at a great degree? Are they accumulating citations from other legitimate places? It seems like there really needs to be kind of a, we need to take this to the next level and say, okay, we have this list, you know, it could potentially be a problem. Now let's see what what the next step is. What do you think? What do you think is the next step?
Those are excellent research questions. I think we should pursue all of that.
Dissertation topic. Anybody wants to do it?
Jeannie?
I'm not getting anything.
Okay. I'd like to thank you for coming and giving us a really exciting and stimulating talk.
Thank you.
Jeffrey, thank you very much. And thank you all in the webinar audience as well. And we will have recordings of this available for you to review in perhaps a month or so online. And stay tuned with notices from our chapter and from the division, and we'll let you know. Thanks.